Today I'm interviewing Bryan Banker. He recently completed his PhD at LMU under Professor Venice. And earlier this year you successfully defended your PhD thesis. So February, so perfect. Congratulations. And you wrote about the influence of the German philosopher Hegel on the literary and performance work of black intellectuals, like W.E.B. Du Bois, not to pronounce it Dubois, like I learned in this lunch, and Paul Robeson. But at the conference you presented on a different topic. Your talk was called "One Cannot Fight Injustice with Decorum, Examining the Restraints of Civility and in Political Discourse." So my first question would be, can you briefly describe how your topic ties into the overall theme of the conference, like aesthetic of restraint?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've done a lot of cultural work in my other research, and I wanted to branch out and thinking about something that's hyper-contemporary and something that I've been thinking about and trying to theorize on my own. And the idea of civility discourse, which is something that's kind of bothered me personally, at least as it exists in the United States. To me, it's a handicap. It's a restraint. And when we first kind of got together to talk about what ideas might be useful in the conference, the idea of civility as a restraint, as this something that holds certain groups back, made me feel like this might be something that I could flesh out from the top. So that was the direction, less about kind of cultural aesthetics and more about like political expression. Like, what does civility do to political expression? And to me, it restrains the civility discourse.
So it's a personal topic for you?
Yeah. I mean, I think in the topic or in the talk itself, maybe my own opinion, or not opinion, but it's all my opinion. My motivation might be a little bit more clearer because it's a political thing. So in that sense, yes, but it's something that I've been contemplating a lot on. What does civility do for people that are excluded, and what can maybe the left do in order to regain some ground in this political discussion right now?
For me, it makes perfect sense because I only know you since yesterday, but to me, you seem like a person who stands like 100% behind what he's doing, and so I like your talk makes sense to me. Like, I felt that it's an important topic to you, and you I'm not saying you convinced me with your
okay. Let's go back in. I've got
we have time for that later. Yeah, sure. But no, it makes perfectly sense for me now. So, but to go back a bit to the roots, civility is an abstract term, and you already mentioned like it's hard to find a definition for it. What approach did you take when you started dealing with the topic? Did you find a definition for yourself satisfying, or are you still looking?
I'm still looking. I think, as I mentioned in the introduction to the talk, that this is a part of the biggest. To me, I think this is one of the bigger obstacles. Is that it seems like the idea of civility has been defined and redefined and shaped into people's discussions in ways that make sense for them, but also I think it makes their arguments easier to ingest, and I think that's a little suspect, or a little maybe perhaps political inauthentic. The definition that I used that made the sense for me in framing what I wanted to discuss about not necessarily the discourse itself of civility, but also what we can do to disrupt and disorganize this kind of centrist thinking. And that was the contemporary utterance of civility, like, let's be civil, and especially in the public sphere. And that is both the kind of the starting point, but also the site of my biggest criticism. I wanted to critique this notion that civility in a public sphere often is dictated by those in power, right?
That's where you link civility to capitalism?
In a way, right? So capitalist power, whether it's both political or financial, or even in conglomeration with one another. I think Trump is a great example because he's a member of this financial elite, but also as president, a member of the political elite. So in that sense, the way in which civility is generally, but especially under capitalist systemization of the public sphere, that is kind of my starting point.
So you're talking about disrupting civility by using vulgarity, right? So that's where I started thinking that when talk a bit about myself, I try to be generally nice to people when I want something, because I feel when I'm mean, I don't get what I want, because it raises resistance.
Yeah.
So my question would be if being uncivil to people or being vulgar causes resistance, how to overcome this resistance with more vulgarity, or where's the end?
Well, and I think this is a vital question because in one sense, the notion is that better yet, civility or between equals, right? I would argue, as I mentioned in the talk, actually builds collaboration. It insinuates people working together, overcoming, kind of conflicts or discourses that might arise between people. However, we rarely see that civility discourse amongst equals, right? And that's the way power functions. That's why I brought it up. And in that sense, vulgarity is used to counteract, right? So if I am protesting a right-wing ideologue in the street and I'm vulgar to him, it's not in the sense that I want to bring him into some kind of civil discussion. And the reason why that's important is because it creates a false equivalency, right? We have this notion that if we put two people of differing opinions in the same room together, they can work it out. And amongst equals and amongst a normative kind of political discussion, sure. However, if you predispose, as American centrists argue, that, well, let's bring in someone who has Nazi leanings and someone who doesn't, that's a false equivalency, right? There's no point to discuss with someone who has hate-filled rhetoric. And so when someone is being vulgar to them, it's not in order to bring them down in a way, and it's not in order to create some kind of equal footing to discuss. It's more to tarnish or diminish their message, or if it's in a, let's say, a reprehensible political operative, like someone who, Kirstjen Nielsen, who I mentioned, she's now gone in the Trump administration, but she was one of the architects of creating these camps, almost concentration camps in a sense, along the American and Mexican border. And people like that should always be shouted down, for the rest of their lives, because we've now, just this week, another child has died in this custody, and that is obscene.
Yeah.
So using vulgarity to shout them down or shout them out of a public space is not to create equal footing. It's a means of challenging the way power functions. But amongst equals, then being vulgar, I think you're right, on a social level. If we're having this conversation and I'm being really rude to you, right, that doesn't foster anything. And so in that sense, the vulgarity that's being directed, it has to be directed at power, as opposed to randomly insulting somebody, because what you want out of that expression, that vulgar thing, is pertinent to what the thing you're talking about. So that's what I meant by vulgarity as an aesthetic of political expression, right? Challenging power, as opposed to something used in social relationships, right? There's a little bit of a difference there.
So we were already talking about the American government right now, of course, and sense of vulgarity, and Trump is definitely using vulgarity as his mean of talking. So would you say that vulgarity is more powerful for politicians, or for people who would try to, a normal person who tries to bring down those power relations? Is it more powerful for one or the other, or is it depending how you use it, are there different kinds to use it efficiently?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. In one sense, it's going to be effective for a political leader to be vulgar because of his platform, right? Trump uses vulgarity on an extremely public level that you and I or regular people simply don't have, right? So in that sense, the platform and the tools that Trump has to express amplifies, right, that vulgarity in ways that we couldn't. So yeah, I mean, clearly in this seat of power, that vulgarity carries a tremendous amount of weight. It's one of the reasons why he's been effective in tarnishing political opponents, right? And that's why you keep seeing this constant barrage of insults, right, to people that he deems a political opponent. And it's been effective. And I think one of the ways in which we can, in order to get a foothold or equate our political expression with those of powerful institutions, powerful people, I think this is where things like throwing a milkshake at a British politician is useful for us. Because if you see Nigel Farage, this right-wing ideologue, he very publicly was attacked by a milkshake, and he's walking with security, drenched in some milkshake. You've seen the picture, right? It's wonderful. But in a sense, it's a way in which to equate our political expression with the platform that Nigel Farage has as a political and financial person, right? That we can bring him down to a level that exposes, right, this false sense of both security, but also this false sense of assurity in his ideas, right, which are extremely problematic. So just in that abject expression of messing his appearance up in his suit, I think is a really powerful way in which to equate the gap between powerful and public people, right? And I think in that way, it's a way in which we can challenge that. Centrists and people that support civility and call for it, they say, well, instead of throwing something at this politician, use your voice at the ballot box, right? Vote. But that, again, supposes or presupposes that there is some equality, right? If I'm African American in the South, or if I'm a college student in Ohio, right, I'm losing, and historically have lost rights to vote or access to vote. And now we have voter ID laws that severely restrict large sections of the population from exercising the very thing that centrists and liberals call for, right? And so if that is unavailable, then people, I argue, should turn to the unsung in order to regain the power of being voice, the voice that has been taken away.
So you mentioned Joe Biden in your talk that he's like campaigning as like the middleman.
Yeah.
So if I understand you clearly, you like would refrain from voting for him because this middlemanship is kind of restraining the society to achieve certain goals.
Yeah. I mean, Biden, he's problematic in different ways. And I would argue that this consensus that of being a middleman covers up or masks crises that we have to deal with. And we see that in three different ways, right? And the first one where you see, right even before maybe he announced his candidacy, right? Somebody in an interview on stage, they had asked about like the millennials, your generation's hardships of overcoming debt, especially in the United States, school debt, or the lack of the stagnation of wages, right, from the 70s, right, the differences, I was saying. And he said, give me a break. Like you young people, you don't know what suffering is, right? Which clearly is...
Because they experience so much.
Right, which, and I think this underscores a really problem in American political discourse in the sense that there's this condescension to young people, millennials in particular, of that, well, they don't really know what suffering is, or let alone someone like Joe Biden, who's instigating policies that have crippled young people now, right? And historically have crippled people of color or women's rights, right? In ways that we're dealing with the really troubling policies that he instigated, years past. And one of the other ways is the way in which we see this middle ground, the way he articulates his approach to Trump, right? And he argues that, well, Trump is some aberration, right? That we just need to get back to normalcy. And that is really troubling in the sense that we've got climate control, which he said he wants to find middle ground on the climate crisis. What does that mean? That's awful. Yeah. Meanwhile, we're all going to get cooked in 50 years and looking for the middle ground. But this argument of Trump is some aberration is really troubling because it assumes that there is no historical development of what Trump represents. And I think there's a clear line between Ronald Reagan in the 80s and maybe neoliberalism in the 70s when it's instigated to what Trump is, this actualization of Reagan kind of politics in different ways. And so that's one of the reasons why I think he's targeted in a tremendous amount of criticism is that this approach to consensus leaves out many people that are, especially young people, or people of color, poor people, working class people, the people, especially working class, that he represents and has represented.